The German soldiers heard it first around 2 a.m., a soft whooshing sound, like wind through branches, like a broom sweeping across the night sky. They called for searchlights. Nothing. The sound came closer. Then the bombs hit. By the time they figured out what was happening, the attackers were gone, vanished into darkness. And the Germans realized something that terrified them more than the explosions themselves. The pilots weren't men. Look, we've all seen the World War II movies, Band of Brothers, Saving Private Ryan, endless stories about guys storming beaches and liberating Europe. And yeah, those stories matter. But here's what nobody tells you. While those men were fighting, there were women dropping bombs from wooden biplanes, women with sniper rifles picking off enemy soldiers from 1,000 yards away, women cycling 300 miles through enemy territory with secret codes tucked in their clothing, women surviving 3 years in Japanese prison camps while still treating wounded soldiers, and most of us have never heard their names. Tonight, that changes. Because the story of women in World War II isn't some footnote. It's not some, oh, and the women helped too kind of thing. These women were warriors, spies, killers when they had to be, heroes when they needed to be. And they did it all while fighting 2 wars at once, one against the enemy and one against everyone who said they couldn't. Let's start with the women who owned the night. October 1941, Moscow's under siege. The Germans are advancing, Soviet forces are getting destroyed, and Joseph Stalin, not exactly known for progressive thinking, is running out of options. That's when Marina Raskova walks into his office. Raskova was basically the Soviet Amelia Earhart, famous aviator, national hero. She'd set long-distance flying records that made international headlines, and she had a proposal that was either brilliant or insane. Let women fly combat missions. Stalin could have laughed her out of the room. But here's the thing about desperate times. They force you to reconsider everything you thought was impossible. Stalin approved 3 all-female air regiments, bomber squadrons, fighter squadrons, and one very special unit that would become legend. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment, their planes, Polikarpov PO-2 biplanes. These things were designed in 1928 for crop dusting and training student pilots. They were made of wood and canvas. Top speed, 94 miles per hour. No radios, no armor. No guns to defend themselves, no parachutes. The Germans flew Messerschmitt fighters that could do 350 miles per hour. Metal construction, machine guns, radio communication. It wasn't a fair fight. But here's what the women figured out. Fairness doesn't matter if you're already dead. These planes were so slow, so light, that German fighters couldn't engage them properly. The fighters would stall trying to match their speed. The Po-2s could turn on a dime, fly low, navigate terrain that would be suicide for faster aircraft. And most importantly, they were quiet. The women developed a tactic that haunted German soldiers for the rest of the war. They'd climb to about 10,000 feet, cut their engines, glide silently toward the target. The only sound was wind through the struts, that soft whooshing noise, like a witch on a broomstick. By the time you heard them, the bombs were already falling. The Germans called them Nachthexen, night witches. It was meant as an insult. The women wore it like a badge of honor. Between 1942 and 1945, the night witches flew over 23,000 combat sorties. They dropped more than 3,000 tons of bombs. They logged 28,606 flight hours. They destroyed river crossings, railways, warehouses, fuel depots, armored vehicles. They conducted 155 supply drops to Soviet forces under siege. Each crew, pilot, and navigator flew multiple missions every night. Some women flew 8, 10, even 15 sorties in a single night. Land, reload, take off again. Over and over until dawn. Irina Sabrova flew 1,008 missions, more than any other pilot in the regiment. Think about that number, over 1,000 times. She climbed into a wooden plane with bombs strapped underneath and flew into enemy territory in complete darkness. 32 night witches died during the war. 23 received the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor the country could bestow. But here's the part that gets me. Here's the part that shows you exactly what women were up against, even when they were heroes. When the war ended, the Soviet Union held a massive victory parade in Moscow. Every major unit marched through Red Square. Tanks, artillery, infantry, fighter squadrons flew overhead. The night witches weren't invited. Why? Their planes were too slow. They'd mess up the formation. The women who'd terrified German soldiers for 3 years, who'd flown over 23,000 combat missions, who'd fought and died for their country. They weren't allowed in the parade because their planes didn't look impressive enough. And people wonder why these stories got forgotten. But the night witches weren't the only Soviet women hunting Germans from the shadows. Between 1941 and 1945, the Soviet Union trained approximately 2,500 female snipers. These weren't symbolic gestures. These weren't propaganda stunts. These were trained killers who accounted for at least 11,000 confirmed enemy kills. Let that sink in. 11,000 German soldiers who never saw it coming. The most famous was Lyudmila Pavlichenko. She killed over 300 enemy soldiers in less than a year, including 36 enemy snipers, which means 36 times she hunted another hunter and won. The Germans called female snipers Flintenweiber, musket women. They found the whole concept bewildering. When they captured Soviet female snipers, they sometimes photographed the bodies as proof. Look at what the Soviets have been reduced to. Using women as soldiers. How desperate. How barbaric. What they didn't understand, or couldn't accept, was that the women were often better at it than men. Sniper work requires patience, discipline, the ability to stay completely still for hours, to wait for the perfect shot, to control your breathing, your heartbeat, your emotions, to make one bullet count. Women trained at specialized sniper schools near Moscow. They learned camouflage, terrain navigation, ballistics. They practiced with the Mosin Nagant model, 1891 for 30, a bolt-action rifle fitted with a scope. And they learned the most important lesson of all. Patience saves lives, yours and your unit's. Rosa Shanina was only 19 when she volunteered after her brother was killed. She became known for something almost unheard of, double kills, taking out 2 enemy soldiers with near-simultaneous shots. She had at least 59 confirmed kills before she was killed in action in 1945. But here's what the statistics don't show. Here's what you need to understand about these women. They didn't start as soldiers. They started as students, nurses, factory workers, young women with dreams that had nothing to do with war. Then the Germans invaded. Then their brothers died. Their fathers. Their towns were occupied. Their families killed or scattered. And these young women, teenagers, some of them, made a choice. They could hide, they could run, they could become victims of a war someone else started, or they could fight back. About 500 of those 2,500 female snipers survived the war. Think about that mortality rate, 1 in 5. Those are terrible odds, and every single woman knew it when she picked up that rifle. They went anyway. Now, let's talk about someone the Germans feared so much. They put a 5 million franc bounty on her head. Massive reward in 1940s France. Enough to set you up for life. Her name was Nancy Wake. The Germans called her the White Mouse because no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't catch her. Wake was born in New Zealand, raised in Australia, became a journalist in the 1930s. She was living in Paris, working for Hearst newspapers, when she witnessed Nazi thugs beating Jewish people in the streets of Vienna. Just random violence. Gangs roving through the city, attacking anyone they thought was Jewish. Most people turned away. Nancy Wake decided she'd seen enough. By the outbreak of war, she was married to a French industrialist named Henri Fiocca, living the good life in Marseille, money, social connections, glamorous parties, everything you'd want. Then France fell, and Wake became a courier for the French resistance. She used her wealth and social position as cover. She'd chat up German officers at checkpoints while carrying forged documents in her handbag. She smuggled Allied soldiers and Jewish refugees across borders. She transported information, money, supplies, whatever the resistance needed. The Gestapo started hunting for her in 1943. They knew someone was running an escape network. They just couldn't figure out who. They tapped her phone, intercepted her mail, followed her when they could. She kept slipping away, like a white mouse. When her network was finally betrayed, Wake escaped to Spain, then Britain. Her husband Henry stayed behind. The Gestapo arrested him, tortured him for information about his wife. He never talked. They killed him anyway. Wake wouldn't learn about his death until after the war ended. She blamed herself for the rest of her life. But in 1944, she had a war to win. Britain's Special Operations executive trained her in everything a spy needs to survive: silent killing, explosives, weapons, radio codes, parachute jumps, survival techniques. Her training reports noted she was a very good and fast shot with excellent field craft. She put the men to shame by her cheerful spirit and strength of character. In April 1944, Wake parachuted back into occupied France as part of a 3-person team. Her mission? Prepare French resistance fighters, the Maquis, for D-Day. The Maquis were basically guerrilla fighters hiding in the mountains and forests of central France. Brave, passionate, mostly untrained. Wake's job was to turn them into an effective fighting force, train them, arm them, organize them into units that could actually accomplish military objectives. Under her leadership, roughly 7,500 resistance fighters coordinated attacks on German factories, communication stations, and supply lines. In one engagement, they successfully fought off 22,000 German soldiers. The math doesn't work in conventional military terms, but guerrilla warfare isn't conventional. Wake understood how to use mobility, local knowledge, and surprise to offset German advantages. One of her fellow resistance officers described her best. "She is the most feminine woman I know until the fighting starts. Then she is like 5 men." There's a story that captures Wake perfectly. When the radio codes were lost, which meant they couldn't communicate with London, Wake cycled approximately 300 miles through enemy territory in 72 hours to arrange for replacement codes, through German checkpoints, past patrols, on terrible roads. For 3 days straight, because the job needed doing. Wake once said, "I don't see why we women should just wave our men a proud goodbye and then knit them balaclavas." After the war, she received the George Medal from Britain, the U.S. Medal of Freedom, France's Croix de Guerre with 2 palms, the Médaille de la Résistance. She eventually became a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. One of the most decorated servicewomen of World War II, Australia, where she'd grown up, was remarkably slow in offering recognition. They didn't appoint her as Companion of the Order of Australia until 2004, when she was 92 years old. Better late than never, I guess. December 8th, 1941. The Philippines. To most American nurses stationed there, the assignment had seemed like paradise. Beautiful weather, light duties, time for golf, beaches, fine dining. The nursing staff at hospitals across the islands, Manila, Corregidor, Bataan, were living the dream. Then the radio brought news that changed everything. The Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. America was at war. And the Philippines, American territory at the time, would be next. Within hours, Japanese planes were bombing Clark Field. Yes, guys, the nurses immediately pivoted from routine care to trauma nursing. Casualties flooded in, burns, shrapnel wounds. Soldiers who'd been caught in the open when the bombs hit. This was supposed to be paradise. Now, it was hell. As Japanese forces invaded the islands, the nurses evacuated from Manila to field hospitals on Bataan and later to Corregidor. They set up jungle hospitals with open-air wards. No walls, just canvas tarps strung between trees. 300, 400 patients per ward, working around the clock in tropical heat while disease spread and supplies ran out. 11 Navy nurses stayed behind in Manila to care for critically wounded patients who couldn't be moved. On January 3rd, 1942, the Japanese captured them. They were held in the St. Scholastica Girls' School, continuing to treat patients under guard. In March, they were moved to Santo Tomas internment camp, a massive prison on a university campus. Meanwhile, on Bataan, the remaining Army nurses worked impossible shifts treating the wounded and sick. Malaria, dysentery, combat injuries, starvation. The American forces were cut off. No supplies, no reinforcements, no hope of evacuation. In April 1942, Bataan fell. The nurses were evacuated to Corregidor, a fortified island fortress in Manila Bay. But everyone knew Corregidor wouldn't hold long. Captain Maud Davison, the chief nurse, faced an impossible decision. There wasn't time to evacuate everyone. She had to choose which nurses would leave and which would stay to face capture. The official story says she drew names from a hat. Her nurses later said that wasn't true. Davison deliberately selected the nurses who were sick, injured, or mentally exhausted, women who probably wouldn't survive captivity. She sent them to safety. The strongest nurses stayed behind. 20 nurses escaped on Navy planes. One reached Australia. The other had to crash land on Mindanao. Everyone aboard was captured. 10 Army nurses and 1 Navy nurse escaped by submarine. They made it to Australia. The remaining 55 Army nurses were captured when Corregidor fell on May 6, 1942. They joined the Navy nurses at Santo Tomas internment camp. 67 women, the largest group of American women ever taken prisoner by an enemy. They would remain captives for 3 years. Here's what people don't understand about POW camps. It's not just about surviving. It's about maintaining your humanity while everything around you tries to strip it away. The nurses organized themselves into shifts. They set up a hospital for civilian internees using whatever supplies they could scrounge. They treated dysentery, dengue fever, hepatitis, starvation, disease. They did it with almost no medicine, no equipment, just skill and willpower. When medical supplies ran out, they improvised. Tree sap for adhesive, drinking straws fashioned from reeds, mosquito nets from banana leaf fibers. In 1943, some of the nurses were transferred to Los Baños internment camp, 40 miles outside Manila. Conditions were even worse there. By 1944, the daily caloric intake was under 800 calories. Some women lost 50 pounds. They suffered from anemia, nerve damage, whooping cough, measles, and starvation-related complications. They kept working, kept treating patients, kept helping others survive even when they were barely surviving themselves. Lieutenant Colonel Nancy Cantrell, Army Nurse Corps historian, said it best. They were a tough bunch. They had a mission. They were surviving for the boys and each other. That does give you a bit of added strength. On February 23, 1945, American forces liberated Santo Tomas. 2 days earlier, Army Rangers and Filipino guerrillas had conducted a daring raid on Los Baños, rescuing over 2,100 prisoners, including 11 Navy nurses. 77 American nurses had been captured in 1942. All 77 walked out alive in 1945. This is unprecedented, especially for women with no formal survival training, especially in conditions designed to kill them slowly. They called them the Angels of Bataan and Corregidor. Some wore the title proudly. Others just wanted people to understand what had actually happened. Mildred Dalton Manning, who survived the camps, lived until 2013. She died at age 98. She once said, "I have never been bitter, and I have always known that if I could survive that, I could survive anything." That's not heroic talk. That's just truth. While women were fighting overseas, millions more were fighting a different kind of battle back home. The arsenal of democracy needed workers, fast. Before the war, about 12 million American women worked outside the home. By 1945, that number had jumped to over 18 million. They built planes, tanks, ships, munitions. They drove trucks and tractors. They worked in factories running 24-hour shifts. But let's be clear about something. This wasn't some liberation movement. This was necessity. Men were overseas. Factories needed workers. Simple math. And the second the war ended, most of these women were pushed out to make room for returning soldiers. Rosie the Riveter got shown the door. Thanks for saving democracy. Now go home and have babies. Over 350,000 American women joined the military during World War II. Not as combatants. American policy refused to send women into combat roles. Public opinion wouldn't tolerate it, so they served as nurses, mechanics, radio operators, truck drivers, pilots who ferried planes from factories to bases. The Women's Army Corps, WAC, the Navy's Waves, Marine Corps, Women's Reserve, Coast Guard SPARs, Women Air Force Service pilots, WASPs. More than 1,600 female Army nurses received decorations for courage under fire. 38 WASP pilots died in accidents. 5 Navy nurses were killed when their plane was shot down. These weren't safe jobs. They just weren't classified as combat. Here's the thing about World War II women that nobody wants to talk about. Yes, they proved they could do the jobs. Yes, they were brave. Yes, they were competent. Yes, they saved lives and won battles and made victory possible. And the moment the war ended, almost everything went back to how it was before. The Night Witches were disbanded 6 months after victory, excluded from the parade, written out of history for decades. Soviet female snipers went home and weren't supposed to talk about what they'd done. It wasn't considered appropriate for women. Nancy Wake received her medals and then struggled for recognition from her own country for decades. Australia didn't honor her until she was in her 90s. American nurses who'd survived Japanese prison camps came home to find that veteran benefits were designed for men. The GI Bill, harder for women to access. Job opportunities, men got priority. Recognition, slow in coming. The WASPs, women who'd flown military aircraft across America, weren't even officially recognized as military veterans until 1977. 32 years after the war ended, they received the Congressional Gold Medal in 2009. 64 years late, women proved they could fight. The world said, okay, but we still don't want you to. But here's the thing. Those women didn't need the world's permission. They never did. Marina Raskova didn't ask nicely. She walked into Stalin's office with a stack of letters from women demanding to serve, and didn't leave until he said yes. Lyudmila Pavlichenko didn't wait for someone to think women could be snipers. She picked up a rifle and proved it. Nancy Wake didn't check with anyone before joining the resistance. She saw evil and decided to fight it. Full stop. The Angels of Bataan didn't get to choose their circumstances, but they chose how they'd face them, with dignity, with purpose, with determination to survive and help others survive. These women fought 2 wars. The first was against the Axis powers. The second was against everyone who said they couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't. They won both. Today we know more about these stories than any previous generation. Books have been written, documentaries made. Museums finally tell their stories. The Night Witches inspired songs and games and novels. Nancy Wake has been portrayed in films and television. The Angels of Bataan have memorials and historical markers. But most people still don't know these names. Most people still think World War II was won by men, while women stayed home and worried. And maybe that's the final insult. Not that these women had to fight for recognition, but that we still have to remind people they fought it all. The Germans who heard that whooshing sound in the darkness learned to fear it. The enemy snipers who hunted Lyudmila Pavlichenko discovered she was a better hunter. The Gestapo agents chasing the White Mouse never caught her. The Japanese guards who thought starving those nurses would break them were wrong. These women were warriors, not despite being women, just warriors, who happened to be women, and who refused to let anyone tell them otherwise. Over 800,000 Soviet women served in the Red Army. Several 100,000 women worldwide served in combat roles, millions more in support positions, millions more in resistance movements, intelligence services, factories, farms, hospitals, and homes. They didn't ask for war, but when war came, they didn't hide from it. And maybe the most important thing we can do now, the only thing that really matters, is make sure nobody forgets again. Because 80 years from now, when someone asks what women did in World War II, the answer shouldn't be, they helped. The answer should be, they fought, they flew, they killed when necessary and saved lives when possible. They survived hell, they refused to quit, and they won. That's the truth. That's their legacy. And that's the story we owe them. Remember the Night Witches. Remember the snipers. Remember the White Mouse. Remember the Angels of Bataan. Remember that when the world was burning, women grabbed buckets and started fighting the fire alongside everyone else. They earned that much, at the very least. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe for more.